Welcome, everyone. My name is Kim Monroe, Marketing Manager for ASCM, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, Optimizing Global Manufacturing, Sourcing, and Distribution. Today, I'm joined by René Buck and Patrick Haex. René is President and CEO of BCI Global, a company he founded in April 1985. More than 35 years later, BCI Global is one of the world's leading independent manufacturing footprint optimization, location, strategy site selection, and supply chain design consulting companies in the world. René specializes in manufacturing footprint strategies and location advice for production plants, distribution centers, R&D centers, and support centers in all regions of the world. Patrick is managing partner and head of the worldwide supply chain practice within BCI. His role is to lead the BCI consulting and implementation delivery team, as well as to interact with clients on supply chain engagements. Before joining BCI 18 years ago, Patrick held supply chain operations and IT functions in manufacturing companies in different industries. And now it's my pleasure to hand off today's presentation to René.
Thank you very much, Kim, for that nice introduction. Patrick and I are very pleased to talk to you today about a very urgent topic, optimization of global manufacturing, sourcing, and distribution. And this is the agenda for this session. After a brief introduction of BCI Global, Patrick will talk about the impact of COVID-19 and the inconvenient truths. One of these inconvenient truths was that we saw supply chains being disturbed for a month. So the question now is, how can you build more resilience in your supply chain? And that's provided in Section 3 Resilience Framework. Then we go over to manufacturing. So what is a future-proof manufacturing footprint? How can you reduce your dependency on China and Asia manufactured products? And we will illustrate that also with what we call a decentralization case study. A lot of people call that reshoring. So if you consider to relocate production capacity out of China or Asia to the US, what kind of considerations have to be taken into account? Sometimes that leads to location study, and we will provide you with a framework how you can make an optimal location choice. And we will finish the session with conclusions and hopefully some Q&A from your side as well. BCI Global works on manufacturing footprint strategy, on supply chain optimization and location studies. As mentioned before, and we do that now for 35 years, with large teams working in offices in Europe, in Atlanta and California, in Shanghai and in Singapore. And we are a global boutique, so specialized in a limited number of fields, but then on a global world. And that was also recognized by Forbes magazine earlier this year, as they listed BCI Global for the second time in a row as one of America's best management consulting firms. On a day-to-day basis, we work for companies in various types of industries. So these are sample of our industries and our clients. You see American companies, European companies, Asian companies. It can be on manufacturing footprint. It can be on location studies or spare parts network design. And it can be in various geographies as well. It could be in Europe, EMEA. It could be in the US, North America, including also with Mexico and Canada, but also in China and Asia. So working for these clients on a day-to-day basis, that is also the background and the base for our presentation of this session. So let's move on to Patrick to give you a glimpse on what we see happening with companies. What is the impact of COVID-19 and what are the inconvenient truths we discovered the last 7 months? Patrick.
Hey, thank you, René, for handing over to me, and thank you, Kim, for the nice introduction at the start. As René said, I think if we look back, towards 2020 and look at the last 9 months and see the development, it's clear that COVID-19 has had a big impact as a health crisis. But even on top of the health crisis that we're still in the midst of, it also is clear that it's going to be a social and an economic crisis. And the renowned IMF has put predictions in place of the cadence of the last few quarters, and they've always been, looking at the world towards 2020 and 2021 in a more negative way, as you can clearly see here. And that also means that the rebound that will take place is going to be, the expectation that will take longer than what we initially thought at the outskirts at the start of the pandemic. So it will take some time for us across all geographies, to recover and to be back on the same pace of economic growth, what we were on and towards the end of 2019. If you look into, what we see from our practice on one of the real kind of 5 key elements where we see companies being hit on, it's basically, the dependence of supplying and supplier base and manufacturing in China. So a lot of companies that are in the room, they definitely will see this where they have suppliers or they have manufacturing sites in China. So when the first wave, of the pandemic hit us, a lot of goods were stuck in transit, or people had a shortage of supply. So that's, I think, clearly recognized. The second point here is the complexity of global trade. If you look into an example of an electronics product, where you basically have different kind of raw materials, either the mining of lithium in Africa, having components shipped from the US and Europe to Asia for assembly, then doing the testing in different parts of Asia, then doing some other activities in other parts of the world, and then shipping it back. The complexity of global value chains has really kind of accelerated over the last few decades. And it also means that companies need to be able to, really have, good handle and grip on how to manage those supply chains. And of course, if you have a disruption like we had with the pandemic, global value chains don't basically lend themselves, to respond very quickly, right? So that's a key element there. We did as BCI a survey late last year about, the need for visibility and the need for supply chain visibility. And what was really clear that a lot of senior executives were pointing out already pre-COVID, like, hey, we need to be having more grip on our supply chain in terms of when events are happening whatsoever. So if you basically look at number 8, the dependency of China as the powerhouse of manufacturing and sourcing, if you understand the complexity of global value chains and the pandemic on top of it, it's obviously that you need to have, good technology in place in terms of really kind of have an understanding of where goods are in transit or at the supplier to really kind of make better decisions across the supply chain. Obviously, we have noticed in different industries where, it's not only the shortage of supply, but moreover, the sudden drop in demand where companies really have hit, minus 90, minus 80, or minus 30 in terms of their volumes, where they're looking at product substitutions. So how to basically make sure that from a sales operations planning point of view, how do you cater and how do you make sure you are able to flex and that you are able to steer demand and make sure that you can satisfy your customers' needs. So the sudden drop in demand is a key kind of aspect that we all have seen in this pandemic. Last but not least, I think we're also preparing for the holiday season in the US. How do you cater for the unexpected accelerated rise of e-commerce, right? So everybody working from home, but also when you look into people buying broad baking machines, other kind of home appliances, really kind of shifted and accelerated the channel mix for many companies, not only retailers, but also brand companies that had to prepare and shift gears all of a sudden. So it basically brings us to 5 inconvenient truths. And I think for the audience here, I would like to ask you to think about like, hey, am I really hit by these kind of developments? And if the answer is no, and if the answer is no to all 5, then I would ask you to to have a cup of coffee or go for a long lunch. But I'm not expecting that, because otherwise you would not have signed up for this webinar. So it's really about how important or how have you been hit on these inconvenient truths. So let's look at what you can do as a professional in this space, right? And supply chain disruptions are not new to us, right? I've seen this a decade ago with the Fukushima. We always have been experiencing this with the hurricanes in Central America several years ago, or the Thai flooding. So we have been doing this, I would say, as a profession for the last 20 or so years. And what we have been typically doing is, the picture what you see here in the middle of the slide is looking at, the ability to predict events, whether that's natural disasters, economic events, or even thefts or strikes, in terms of, hey, what is the event, what is the probability of the event happening, and what is the likelihood that it will happening, and the impact of that particular event. So we're trying to use this 2x2 matrix to say, how can we categorize and how can we make an impact and a mitigation plan accordingly. And the problem with this is that it takes a lot of time, and it's very hard to estimate the events that will where the probability, like a pandemic, is that it will happen is very low, but the impact can be huge. So that's where the 2x2 matrix basically is not really helping us. This is a survey done by McKinsey showing that if we look into all of the events that you see here on the 2x2 matrix, like how often are we being hit by a disruption? How frequently is it happening? And how can we categorize those vulnerabilities and the ability for us to anticipate? And I think it's striking here is that if you look into the figure on the right, is that almost once every 3 years we have a disruption of basically a 2 to 4 weeks impact. So this is really severe. So we need to be prepared. And how can we be prepared? Is a concept about resilience. And I know that you can read books about resilience, and a lot of people are using resilience, but really when we define resilience, it's about how the ability of a supply chain, a related organization, to get back after a major disruption, right? So that's a little of the definition. But what this really for us really means is that it's about competence. It's about competence as an organization from an end-to-end supply chain point of view. It's about capabilities and empowerment of people in that organization, regardless of any nature of origin, whether that's a major strike or whether that's a pandemic or whatever disruption you're having. And I think this is really a key concept that people need to put to bed and really make explicit on where to put investments and how to kind of cater for resilience in your supply chain. So if you look into the concept of resilience, the slide articulates that. It's like a lot of supply chain leaders, almost 93%, are looking in ways to increase resilience, which is great. Even if you look into the other number here, 44% is even willing to increase resilience if that would mean additionally higher costs. So people are willing to invest additional costs in order to be more resilient. If you look at what the typical or the top resilience factors are, or resilience strategies are, you see elements like dual sourcing, increasing of buffers, talking about the nearshoring and regionalization supply chain, which we also going to address in a minute. But these are very much the physical footprint kind of layers, but there are also elements in there from organization and from a technology point that we would definitely recommend companies to visit on. So what we've developed as BCI is what we call a resilience wheel, and it basically caters on the outer ring the vulnerabilities that you want to cater or what you want to assess from, right? So that's geographical risk, economic risk aspects, like we almost forgot on those trade disputes on the US-China trade war. We have Brexit upcoming here, the pandemic, terrorist attacks, all of those different kind of risk sources that you can imagine. But at the heart of it, it's really about how you can cater for mitigating all of those risks, not knowing exactly when they will happen, but not always investing in physical assets, but making sure you have the competence in place. So think about the elements in green, which are related to the footprint, and René and I will talk later about that. So that could be linked to buffering, building up inventory, decentralization of production logistics, for instance. It's about the organization, and I think about having the right BCP protocols in place, so business continuity planning. It's about the organization, the risk culture and leadership in the organization, about financial liquidity, for instance, and the technology and infrastructure, where you can imagine about how do you collaborate with your suppliers and ecosystem. It's about stress testing your supply chain, but also in terms of having the right visibility in your end-to-end supply chain. So some of those examples. In the next few minutes, I'll take a few clear examples on how you can make resilience explicit in your organization, and that you also can make the right trade-off on where to focus on. And as a first one, it's on the organizational side, and it's called business continuity planning. And business continuity planning has been around for quite a while. And if you look into their effectiveness of COVID and how people have been responding with COVID, it is not that people are very kind of satisfied. So a recent poll that we did as BCI, showed that 95% of the people are not really satisfied with the effectiveness of business continuity planning, because they were not updated. They were very much looking at a silo where the pandemic is really a chain of events. So if you fix one element, you don't fix other elements along the chain. So this is really a key warning for people. Like if you want to be more resilient, you need to make sure that the BCP is also effective into dealing with risk management, and it helps you to incorporate resilience. If I go to the next one, which talks about control towers, it's really about how to make sure you have the right level of visibility. And if you would ask people, and we did that as BCI, a recent poll, in terms of do you really have end-to-end visibility in your supply chain? The number is very low. It is lesser than 10 or 15% of companies that really have end-to-end visibility. And if you ask the same question, like, hey, given COVID, would you like to have, or do you see the urgency of having a end-to-end visibility in place? The answer is almost 100%. So what it really is about is that, and control towers are nothing new. We've had the concept in place for almost a decade. But what you really need is a type of control tower that is basically a mechanism, a kind of a concept of systems and processes and people really overarching and navigating the global supply chain to make sure you have the visibility at your fingertips, that you are in grip of your supply chain and can ultimately make better decisions. Important, I think, in this area is on, you can do that different ways, right? You can look at that from a manufacturing to a distribution center perspective. You can look at that from a customer facing perspective, like everybody knows the Amazons example with the Prime and the visibility they have there. But I think, if you look into COVID, the key element which was lacking for many companies is the upstream. So do you have access to your suppliers' inventory and their supplier base, and even their suppliers of their suppliers? And that's really, you really need to dig in to your bill of material to make sure you have that visibility. And what we have seen is that where in the past people were focusing only on one silo as a starting point, so whether it was intercompany or downstream, you see companies now really looking for, hey, we need to really embed this on a global basis for the full supply chain. And I always make the example that you need to be you need to recognize yourself as like, do you want to cater for complexity in your supply chain? So I mentioned a few minutes ago that on the 5 inconvenient truths, that we are very dependent on sourcing in China with the supplier base. We have very complex global value chains in place. So we really at a crossroad where we need to say, hey, we either want to accommodate that complexity going forward, and if that's the case, then you really need to invest in concepts like control towers to really make sure that you have the right steering wheel in your car, so to say, to navigate or take complexity out. And that's where René will talk later about regionalization and decentralization. So how to make this value explicit for your company. Different companies can do different things. So we see companies in fast food consumer goods also taking into account the sustainability, the empty mileage, the carbon emissions, whereas other companies are very much focusing on the cost in terms of dollars, in terms of how can we take costs out. But it's also about predictability in your supply chain, right? So do you know when the container is expected to arrive in Long Beach or in different ports in the US? And ultimately, visibility is great, but if your supply chain is stable and there's no disruption, visibility is not going to help you much, right? So it ultimately also needs to drive better decision making. And we, as BCI, have developed a framework where we help companies like yourself to really kind of make these kind of trade-offs explicit and to price, hey, what is this concept is going to bring, because it doesn't come for free. If you look into the technology, so if you talk about control towers, they need to be powered by technology, and there's different levels that we differentiate in terms of what kind of technology applications are out there, and they all have a certain fit for purpose. You have the basic visibility platforms, which give you basic visibility, gives you dashboards, give you one mode or multiple modes, and they can be very helpful for data collection. Think about, for instance, a Transmart or a Project 44. So they also have been easy to implement, a lower cost to use, so to say. You have your basic TMS that has been around for a longer period of time, where you can think about an SAP or Oracle OTM or Descartes, which is really a classical transportation management system, including also global trade management functions, doing the exception management. And then you really have what we call the true end-to-end, where it's about end-to-end visibility, but also tying the world of planning, so sales and operations planning, supply planning, inventory planning, demand planning, with the world of physical logistics, and really making sure that you have better steering wheels in your car to navigate. And think about, companies like Era Technology, for instance, or Blue Yonder, formerly known as JDA, who have the right tools in place there. But it also comes with an ROI. So you need to think about, hey, what's the best value and why do I need this? And how do I sell this internally to my senior leadership? So this is an example of the technology aspect in terms of resilience. If we look into the another example here, it's what I call optionality in transportation logistics. What have we seen in COVID? One of the lessons learned is that, yes, we have carriers in place, we have infrastructure in place, that's all great. But did we have the ability to shift volumes from one provider to another? Did we have the ability to shift volumes from air to ocean or from one ocean carrier to the other? And the answer is like, not really entirely. So what's really important here is that throughout the whole supply chain, we put in place optionality in transportation and logistics, and that means different kind of carriers in different lanes, having make sure you have different kind of trade lanes operated and set up in your systems, because this is easier said than done. Let's be very realistic. If you have work with a logistics provider in Europe or in Asia Pacific or in the US, you need to make sure that you also have a second or a backup facility in place, either operated by the same provider or by a different provider. So what is really required here is that you invest as a company in making this decision to say, hey, we need to have duality or optionality in a transportation logistics setup, but also have a standard system, standard operating procedures, making sure you have contracts in place. All of those kind of good examples. And to give you a real life example for one of our clients, a company that was faced with a lockdown in Spain, they had a facility in Spain outsourced to a third-party logistics provider. They had a backup facility in Germany, but because they did not set up their SAP system properly, the Spanish DC could not deliver to Spanish customer, but because of the systems limitation in Germany, they were not able to ship directly to the customers in Spain because of VAT and legal issues. So those kind of things seem very simple, but if you want to do this properly, you really need to set this up correctly. Yeah. So that's an example of the footprint on optionality. If I shift gears on how can you optimize your footprint from a distribution point of view, many of you might have seen this picture to say, hey, this might be a classic way how companies have done this in the past. You want to look into the horizontal axis, how many distribution nodes they need to have. And on the vertical axis, you look into the dollar costing in terms of, hey, what's the sweet spot for many different companies. And this was always the case in the past about how companies were looking at, setting up their distribution network. Well, that's only part of the story, right? So if you look into the learnings of COVID and the pandemic, it's really paramount to address and put in place, the risk and resilience considerations. So looking at the footprint, but also the organization and the competences, the technology and infrastructure, but also the service objectives, some of the design constraints, whether that's impact on law and regulatory aspects, as well as the cost objective. So it's really, a more fundamental aspect where you need to put all of those parameters to the conversation to really make sure, hey, what do we want to accomplish? Whereas in the past, we would typically do this once every 3 years, or once every 5 years when leases were expiring. COVID also has pushed us to say, we need to have data at our fingertips. We need to have a data repository where we can pull data from and basically make these analysis, much more on a hourly or weekly basis rather than once every 3 years basis. So that also means that companies should think about how to properly set up and gear up for making those trade-offs in your firm. I just want to end up here with an example of a case study. This is a case study of a very fast growing company in the consumer electronics for home appliances. So you can imagine also that they have been growing very rapidly by the whole COVID situation, because everybody wants to have a clean house. And they were experiencing quite some challenges, right? So they had I would say a fragmented footprint because of their history. They had ambitious growth targets. They wanted to go for increased delivery options. They were experiencing the Amazon effect in terms of multiple channels and peaks within those channels. Their current footprint was not geared really to kind of cater for direct e-commerce e-commerce fulfillment, and also wanted to be much more closer in terms of their delivery model and speed to market. So what you can see in the middle here is really growing by a 7x in the direct side, so on the e-commerce and everything that goes with commerce, with mobile commerce, and almost doubling its size in retail. And the question was like, hey, how do we make sure we have a scalable infrastructure from a cost, from a risk, and from a service perspective in place? So we use different kind of tools. We can use Analyses and other tools. We kind of say, how can we make sure that we do the analysis and then take into play all of these kind of factors. And if you go to the results, it's really about how to make sure you have the right trade-off for your senior management to say, from where we were in the past, from a decentralized footprint, how can we move towards a much more aligned footprint, and what are the right tipping points, and why do we need to move from this model from A to B, but also, hey, what will this bring us from a service level? What does this bring us from a cost play? What will this bring us from a risk and resilience point of view? So these kind of processes and tools will definitely help you to address that question. So that's where I would like to end. I would like to pass the ball back to René. René?
Thank you, Patrick. Patrick mainly talked about supply chains and distribution networks. Let's include the manufacturing plants as well, because as Patrick mentioned in the beginning of his presentation, one of the things we acknowledged during COVID-19 was that manufacturing plants in China and in Asia, suppliers in China were not working well, were not delivering the products. So we came to the conclusion, that's what we call the inconvenient truth, that we were so dependent in the US and in Europe on these Chinese suppliers and these China-based manufacturing plants that people are now looking to, how can we future-proof that? Now, conceptually, you can have different types of strategies. You could say, I have a product or a product line, and I produce it in one plant for the whole world market. You could also say, I have for EMEA and for APAC and for North America, regional plants, we call that geo-hubs. You can also say, I want to be more and more closer to the markets, whether those are consumers or clusters of industries, and that's decentralized manufacturing. And you have also a strategy where companies, often in a combination of CMOs, using CMOs and own manufacturing capacity, and what we call a loosely coupled manufacturing ecosystem. So there are various ways to organize that. Now, we see considerations and a trend towards looking into decentralization. So not being dependent anymore on one or two manufacturing plants producing a certain product, how can we reduce that? And the reasons to decentralize, to have more manufacturing plants, is based on supply chain drivers. So the sourcing risk, we mentioned that already before. And that can be enhanced by new technologies, new smart manufacturing technologies, which give you the opportunity to produce in smaller batches so that you not for economies of scale only are developing worldwide covering plants. There are also external disruption risks which drive this decentralization trend. Pandemic, obviously, but also trade barrier risk. Let's not forget that for a large number of American companies, already in 2016, the discussion started on decentralization. When the trade tariffs came into place, first 50% and 35%, retaliated by the Chinese government. So trade barrier risk is also something which is here to stay. And it's our idea that independent, who will be in the White House as of early next year, that this trade dispute between the US and China is here to stay. It's not going away. Perhaps the tone and the process will be different depending on who will win the elections, but it's not a dispute which will be solved in a late Friday afternoon. So trade barrier risk are also reasons to say, are we still okay with the manufacturing footprint we have? Where do we produce our products right now? And it can be governmental push, what we particularly see in healthcare products, to have those products being produced close to the home base. There could also be what we call strategic customer benefits, so made in advantage, so made in the US or made in Germany. That could also add to the value proposition you have as a company. So there are various drivers where you say, okay, well, this looks like decentralization is the solution for everything. Is that true? It's easier said than done. In our day-to-day work, in our teams in the US, in China, in Singapore, and Europe, we see every day it's not that easy. And you have to wonder if you decentralize or the reshoring. So suppose you bring some products back from China to the US, What is the size of the local workforce? Is that specific know-how and experience available? Think about supplier base. It's great, you know, if you have a ventilator being used in the intensive care rooms, it has 500 components. Okay, you can bring back assembling of those ventilators to the US, but you're still sourcing all these hundreds of components and sub-assemblies in that final assembly. So if you don't future-proof those supply chains, then you are still in trouble. So if you want to set up a ventilator business in the US, are there relevant suppliers available? What does the ecosystem look like? But also, what about cost? What about markets? Because whatever predictions you look, pre and post COVID-19, Asia is still one of the most important growth markets in the world. So in that discussion between decentralization, there are drivers to look at, but you have also to look into what the reality is on a day-to-day basis. So what we see happening for American and European companies is that they shift to China plus one, again, already fueled by the discussion on trade disputes, because at that point in time, a lot of Western companies thought already, hey, it's not a great idea to have all our production eggs in one Chinese basket. So they started to look into Vietnam and to Thailand and Malaysia. You have regionalization, so closer to the customers and have plants in the various parts of the world. And you have also a further decentralization of the global footprint. So there are different ways how you can mitigate that particular risk. And it has its pros and cons. So China only has the economies of scale advantage. It has, in some industries, and certainly in the electronic industry, an unprecedented depth of ecosystem, which is not easy can duplicate. But on the other hand, we saw the dependency. Labor costs are increasing on the East Coast. You still have long distance, so we are more vulnerable for distortions of that process. So China only has its pros and cons, and it heavily depends. If you have a manufacturing plant there, is it producing completely for foreign markets, so for the US or for Europe, or is it 50% for the Chinese market, 50% for non-domestic markets? So there is no easy way of saying, okay, everybody should do it. You have to look into the way how you organize it. But for many companies, we see China plus one. So reducing the risk by being too dependent on China. Think about that trade risk. Again, you still have, if you have to ship your products from Vietnam or Malaysia back to the US, that also still a large distance. High transportation costs also involved. And a lot of companies have experienced that, for example, the ecosystem and the supplier base in these Southeast Asian countries is not that great as you would expect or what they hoped for. And then we have that regionalization, also mentioned as reshoring. Okay, bring back some production capacity to the US home market or to Europe home market. It gives you a reduction of supply chain risk. But on the other hand, you have to look, can we really do it in a cost-effective way? Is it really possible to set up these manufacturing plants in the US and Europe in a cost-effective way, which please the customers with optimal service levels? Now, to look into that, you can take two perspectives. One perspective is, okay, we have to look into our global footprint. So you have 12 production plants all over the world, and you look into what kind of products are we going to produce with what technology for what markets where. I repeat, because those are the four key questions. What products, with what technology, for what markets where, and obviously also against what cost. And you could say there are various steps to be taken. If you really want to take that holistic approach, you start with a kind of as-is analysis. What are your 12 plants currently doing? You develop scenarios. I will show you an example. You develop scenarios in a way that you have various current optimization, current footprint optimization scenarios, but also think out of the box scenarios. And then you try to assess them on cost, on customer perspective, on risk. So scenarios is great because they give you a view of a bandwidth of potential future footprints, and then you assess them in detail, what they are really bringing to the table. And at the end of the day, you choose the most optimal scenario, and that optimal scenario leads often to what we call a footprint transition program. You consolidate, you build something new, you close, whatever is coming out of your exercise to do it. So in that footprint scenario development, that's an important element. And it's also important to not only look into your current plans, how can you optimize the production capacity in your 12 plants, for example, with adding additional shifts, but also with new locations. Think out of the box on that. How would Mexico, where you, if you have not a plant now, how would a Mexican plant help you in future-proofing your footprint, or in Central and Eastern Europe, or in Vietnam? It doesn't matter where you want to do it. Footprint scenario development is important. And we use for that a software tool, what we call the donor-receiver principle. Because you could say, okay, I have a plant in China, it has 4 production lines, I relocate 2, okay, but that does also mean that the performance of your Chinese plant, where half of the production halls are empty now because you relocated 2 production lines, you have to look into the impact of that as well. And that donor-receiver principle was the basis of proprietary software developed so that you can easily make comparisons between scenarios. Okay, we have now a number of scenarios, and then you do the assessment. Total landed cost. So we include operating cost, we include capex, but also a transition cost. You know, in some geographies in the world, if you close a plant, you have to, you are obliged to have severance pays. You have to negotiate on terms where you can lay off people. So costs mean OPEX, CAPEX, transition costs. But we have to the assessment of the scenario also customers. What does it do for our customers in time to market, in flexibility, in scalability, in service orientation? And we have to look into conditions. Conditions, mainly also the risk profile. You can go to the lowest cost locations on Earth, but what does that do for the risk profile of your footprint? So if you have developed a number of scenarios, and in some studies we go even to 80, 90 scenarios, you analyze them on the 3 C's: cost, customer, conditions. And that leads, and you can see that here on the right-hand side of the slide, that leads to a footprint program where you expand, set up something new, consolidate, refurbish, modernize, whatever you do with these, my example of the 12 plants. Now, we mentioned before that decentralization, that element of reshoring, is becoming more and more important. There is in every conversation we have with manufacturing plants, manufacturing clients, they bring to the table the issue, how can we future-proof? Because people are asking, should we not have more plants in the Western Hemisphere? If you look to a couple of surveys, this is from Thomas Industrial, and you can see here that the number of people who said, yeah, likely or very likely or extremely likely we will reshore, that number is increasing. So it's certainly on the agenda, and it shows even for CFOs. This is a survey from the UBS Bank among American CFOs, and you can see here in the answering the question, what percentage of China production does your company plan to move or has already moved out of China? These are pretty substantial percentages. You see that. And if you use on the right-hand side, those same CFOs of American company, well, when do you plan to move production capacity out of China? That's also relatively short notice. And if you ask those same CFOs, which of the following statement best describes your company's strategy of moving production, and then the dark blue is already companies, we are doing it. The light blue is we are planning to do so, and 24 says we don't do anything. So 3/4 of a company have this issue on the table. And obviously in certain sectors of industry, that's more relevant than in other sectors of industry. So just for leaving that here. Now, if you talk about this decentralization, that reshoring. Now let's walk you through an example. And obviously you can imagine within the session. It's a styled business case, but it gives you a good example of what kind of steps and what types of considerations you should take into account. And obviously, this case is a case for you, for your company, it will obviously be different. But we are talking here about a US company with high-tech manufacturing operation in coastal China, so in Shenzhen, Southeast China, making panels, bringing those products produced by 250 people. And you can see here also the sourcing. So the components and sub-assembly are mainly coming from China itself or the rest of Asia, and only small parts from Europe and the US. And then you see where is the product going to. And here in this case, 80% is going to the US and to Europe. So it shows you that sourcing and distribution are important elements how to look into what the results would be of such a reshoring case. So we have this company, and the company has 4 production lines. And we have a scenario where they all stay in China. We have a scenario where they are relocated for 100% to the US, and we took here Chicago as an example, and Illinois, or you relocate 2 production lines, 50%, and you could also say only 1 production line, because if you, for 1 production line, you could at least say, well, I have mitigated my risk a little bit. In this presentation, we focus only on the full reshoring, so scenario 1 and scenario 2. But you understand the concept, so it's about what can we move, and we analyze this project in 5 different steps. So we're looking into operating cost analysis, labor costs, real estate costs, transportation costs, custom duty. So what does it cost to produce the product or completely in China or completely in Chicago or half-half? We look into the quality of the business environment. And you see here the factors we looked at: labor availability, international accessibility, financial and economics risk. What about IP infringement risk? That's also something to take a close look at. But we also added, and Patrick was already mentioning, what are the costs of lockdown? So we calculate for companies what is really, if you have once in 3 or 5 years, your production line completely stopped for 2 months, what are the costs you have to take a look into that? And then we look into qualitative elements, meeting customer expectations. So distance to customers, political and geopolitical risk, natural disaster risk, those are also elements which are of importance, and you look to lockdown costs as well. And the last element is more about trade sensitivity. Let's say if you have a product which is sensitive for trade disputes, then that's also something to consider. So let's look into the various analysis. So if you go to the cost analysis, as you can imagine, China is cheaper than Chicago. Shenzhen is cheaper than Chicago. So you can clearly see that here in full reshoring, you bring all your you close your China factory and you open up a new one in Chicago. Half reshoring is taking both ways. So 50% production in China, 50% in the US. You can also look into, as a second element, in the quality of the business environment. So in running and smooth operations, how do the various locations fit? And we do that on, sorry, I go 1 slide back. If you look to the factors you look here in, you discuss with the client what are the weightings of the categories and the individual factors. So it's about labor availability, labor relations, ease of doing business, risk. So you include these factors to be sure that you are on the safe side and that you can have an objective comparison between Shenzhen and Chicago. And you can see here how that works on a cost quality matrix. On the vertical axis, you see, and we take the 100% reshoring. On the vertical axis, you see the 5-year operating cost. And the higher you are on the vertical axis, the cheaper it is. And so you can imagine that the CFOs look to the vertical axis and say, well, hey, this is clear. China is cheaper. If you include also on the horizontal axis the weighted quality, so all these factors which we just mentioned and which are scored for Chicago and Shenzhen, and obviously in many locations we do that for far more locations, then you assess all these factors in a score between 1 and 5, 1 being poor, 5 being excellent, and with the weights of this particular company, you get a weighted quality index. So the further right on the horizontal axis, you have a better performance and quality of the business environment. Now with 50% reshoring, what we did is we took the quality scores of 50% for Chicago, 50% for Shenzhen, for the simple reason because you have 2 production lines in China and 2 production lines in the US. Obviously, if you look to these pictures, the best place where you want to be is in the upper right-hand cell, right? Because that's where you combine low overall production costs with great quality of the business environment. And nobody wants to have production facilities in the bottom left cell, because that's where you have an unfavorable combination of high cost and low quality of the business environment. Now, then we looked into lockdown cost analysis, because that's also an important element. And it's obviously a guess. So what we assumed here is a once in a 5-year lost output of 2 months. We looked into what would that mean for the company. And that can be expensive. And if it's a realistic assumption, and you saw in the McKinsey analysis, they are on the same track as us in these kind of analysis, that you have to add that because it diminishes the gap if you only look to current production costs between China and other locations outside China. So adding lockdown costs is a good way to at least show what the sensitivity is of the analysis if you keep all your production eggs in one basket, right? And then we talk about meeting customer expectations, so distance to customer markets, political and geopolitical risk, natural disaster risk. So how do you include those kind of factors? And again, with a weighted quality score, I don't repeat that with all the sub-factors again, but here you can see also that the results for Chicago are better than for Shenzhen. So customers give an advantage in terms of having products being produced in the US and being having a less riskier supply chain than having that production only in China. And then we looked into the trade duties impacts of sensitivity analysis. And that's obviously very dependent on the type of product you have, right? Our products where you have no input duties, but you have also products, if you produce them in China and you import them into the US, then you have to pay input duties. And if that's 25%, and in this case, that's an example, then it's tremendous amount of money which you have to take into account as well. And again, it depends on your belief when these trade duties will evaporate. But our opinion is, as mentioned before, that they will stay here for certainly the next couple of years. So it's a realistic assumption to take that into account as well. So we have these 5 different analyses. So we started with, as this here for full reshoring. If we only look to the operating cost for 5 years, there was an advantage of $54 million for China. If we include lockdown costs, the lockdown costs in this case calculated for $11 million, so you see that the gap is already diminishing. Now, if you look to also the trade issues and you look to the customer expectations and the quality of the business environment, the differences are not that huge anymore. You see there, so my initial difference in producing from 54 is now being reduced to 6, because we don't have to pay input duties anymore for, at least in this case, all production lines. So that makes the comparison between the two more interesting. And you can also see that in quality of the business environment, we saw that the US was better, and also in meeting customer expectations, the US was doing a better job than China. So you can see here that in full reshoring, the differences diminish. If you look on the half reshoring, so in this case, and again, I underline again, it's depending on the business case, but in this case also you can see how the differences have diminished over time, and even there's an advantage in cost. And then added to that, the advantage in quality of the business environment, and added to that, the advantage of producing in the US from a customer perspective, you see here that there is a real business case. It's case specific, ladies and gentlemen, it's industry specific. It heavily depends on what is your sourcing pattern. It heavily depends on what is the distribution pattern of your brand, but it shows that this might be an interesting opportunity for your company to take a closer look at. And we have a standardized model where you can include all these kind of assumptions and considerations, so that if the C-level asks you, hey, should we do Should we change? Should we some product or product categories bring to the US? And this framework could possibly help you. Another framework which possibly could help you, and that's the last part we're going to discuss, is about how do you do a location study for a plan. So based on your footprint optimization, based on your reshoring analyses, based on your discussion internally about decentralization, it could be that you say, well, we need a new plan. Now, whether that's in Southeast Asia or in Europe or in Mexico or in the US, doesn't matter. If you talk about location study, that's a filter down process. And what you want to bring to the table as a professional is good, solid data and a good proven methodology. Because let's be honest, it's a little bit like football, right? Everybody has an opinion on it. Every person within a company, every businesswoman, every businessman has good, bad, and ugly experiences all over the world. So bringing down a number of locations to a recommended location, the best location, but also that you can show how that's being done, that's an important element for the credibility and the alignment internally of a new production plant. Now, if you think about it, we have attendees in this session from automotive sector, but also medtech, also from chemical intermediate products, consumer electronics. Now, if you think about a manufacturing plant, whatever the manufacturing plant is, you have three different types of location factors. You have cost criteria, everything you can express in dollars or in euros or whatever currency you want. You have quality criteria, referring to the quality of the business environment, and you have risk criteria. Think about financial risk, political risk, legal IP risks, etc. Cost is in money, quality of the business environment is that score between 1 and 5, and we have a risk, which also, depending on your type of operations, you can weight the various types of risk, and then again, you give them with good solid data, you try to assess the risk as they are important for your new plant. Let me give you a quick example. Now, we have a company and we look into the cost requirement. Land cost, building cost, we have various job titles, so you look into what are the total employers' costs, and we forecast that for the next 5 years because you have inflation, you have expected wage increases. Certainly, for example, now also in Southeast Asia, we see that labor costs are increasing because so many companies are flooding into that area. We have distribution costs, inbound, outbound, utility costs, taxes, which we consider as a cost, and perhaps you are eligible to incentives, and then you can deduct them. So if you analyze, say, 8 locations, for 8 locations, you can calculate what is the bill we have to pay for the next 5 years to operate in all of these 8 different locations. The same approach of these 8 locations is what you do with quality of the business environment. And again, here it's depending on what your company is looking for, various types of elements. You can add elements to it. You can skip elements which are not relevant for your case. You make that for your individual case specific weighted index. So you use the weightings which are important to you. And then you have data to assess the 8 locations. A lot of people think about, if you talk about quality, say, René, that's qualitative, that's subjective, that is emotional. Not true. Not true. The vast majority of all these factors, there are good, solid data available in reports, in our databases, so that you really can, on an independent basis, compare locations also on all these qualitative elements. And that's the same goes for risk. So you have various types of risk, depending on your operation, depending on the geographies. Is currency risk a risk or not? Is legal an important element for your types of business, also related, for example, to IP? So here again, you have a number of factors. You weigh them according to your case. You score them between low, medium, and high, and those are the ways to do it. Okay, so we have 3 different location categories: cost, quality of the business environment, and risk. How do you bring them together? And we bring them together in many cases already for 3 decades in what we call a cost quality risk matrix. So here again, on the vertical axis, and you recognize it from our reshoring case, on the vertical axis, you have cost, so upper side of the vertical axis, low cost. On the bottom, you see the 120 high cost. So here again, you see the green smiley on the upper right-hand cell, because that's where you combine low cost with high quality of the business environment. Then we use the coloring of the locations to show what the risks are. Now, you could easily say, hey, I want the ranking, and then you say cost is 60%, and quality of the business environment is 25%, and risk is 50%, and in a sec, you have a ranking. But this is also interesting to discuss with your team, where people have different functions and different backgrounds, so they will assess the locations and this picture, the trade-off between cost, quality of the business environment, risk. Everybody will do that in the same. So if you go to location E from Edward, okay, that's the cost leader. If you go to location A from Anthony, that's the quality of the business environment leader. You could also consider location B or I, and because those are perhaps a little bit best of both worlds, but location B from Berlin has a high risk. Okay, go then into the data. What is that high risk, and can I mitigate that? And if it's about currency, can I hedge that currency risk? So this gives a fantastic argument, a fantastic base for your discussions at the C-level. If we have to set up a new plant, how do we integrate cost, quality of the business environment, and risk factors? And that brings me to the conclusions. I think it's clear, and I think the vast majority of our attendees today will agree with this, confirm that global value chains will never be the same as before. We have seen COVID-19 was just not a distortion for a hurricane. Now, this is a major shift for many companies in their thinking, in the way how they want to add resilience, in the way how they want to redesign their distribution networks, in the way how they, as Patrick explained, want to increase that visibility with really end-to-end control towers. That's what a lot of companies have on their agenda right now. Companies are also looking for resilience in their footprint. So how can we diminish the risk of having only one location where we produce a certain product line? How can we review those strategies and redesigning the manufacturing footprint, including reshoring? And again, and decentralization could be an option. We are not saying, we are not advocating it, we are not lobbying for it, we are only saying it's something you should consider. And also, as Patrick showed in the resilience wheel, it's not only about the footprint where you have physical operations, but also on how technology and organization can help you. In the last part, we talked about choosing a new production, and the same goes for distribution location. So including for your specific operation, all relevant cost factors, quality of the business environment factors, and risk factors, you have to take them into account. And the framework often gives you the opportunity to integrate those various types of location factors once you have to make that important decision. So what we see now in this year, which is so challenging for everybody, that we see that companies after a kind of lockdown phase and emergency phase are now picking up again and saying, well, we should do something to avoid the same trouble as we had before, and are now looking into scenarios and options and strategies to be sure that you are on the right track. So to end with a positive note, before we go to Q&A, see it also as an opportunity. See the current situation also an opportunity to change. I'm sure that you will have the attention of the C-level, because de-risking supply chain, building robustness in your manufacturing footprint, that's on the top of the agenda of all leaders in corporations all over the world.
Thank you, René and Patrick, for this excellent presentation today. We're running short on time, so we only have time for a couple of questions. So the first one I will pose to Patrick. Network design has been a concept for a few decades. What is the impact of COVID on the frequency and process to review the network?
That's a great question that you're posing, Kim. Thanks for asking that. There's a few elements, right? So I was already indicating in the presentation, like in the past, people were doing this once every 3 or 5 years when there was a lease coming up for a building, or there was a key shift in some of the market dynamics or in the business strategy. But what you have seen in the pandemic, what was already triggered by the impact of the global trade war is that senior management doesn't want to wait for 5 months or 6 months of reviewing data and analysis to get the numbers ready and their strategies ready, right? So I think the pandemic really has pushed forward that people need to kind of make sure that you have the data at your fingertips, that you can do much more fast, I would call it fast network design initiatives, where you have the data ready, you can populate the analysis on a cross-functional team basis, you can run scenarios very quickly. René was making the case about the import duties, right? So that's a concept also in there, like, hey, how can you test the impact if that import duty is going up or down or is vanishing? And I think from a COVID-19 and from a pandemic point of view, it's really important that the speed is important. So how quickly can you make those analysis? It's about the holistic way of looking at your supply chain. We can look at one part, but then if you have the lockdown situation that we've seen, it doesn't give you the right balances and the right answers. So it's about speed, it's about the process in terms of having the right functional scope and making sure, and I think that's the last comment I want to make here, is to embed and make the risk and resilience as an explicit part of that trade-off. So what can you do and how does that tie into the footprint, and what can you do beyond the footprint? Because not always the best investment is in brick and mortars, but it can be somewhere else.
Thank you, Patrick. Now this one, René, I will give to you. Which industries and commodities do you see the decentralization reshoring taking off?
Let's say we see examples in all types of industry. It's clear that in healthcare, think about medical technology products, think about the PPE products we were discussing so much in the pandemic period. So that's an industry where a lot of these discussions are taking place. We see it also in tech industries, more in general. And you have to look not only to the industries, but to the profile of the plants and the products. The profile of the products, if we saw in my examples that the impact of trade disputes and trade tariffs can really can make or break your business case. We also know that if you have a manufacturing plant where you, in China, even in this example, and you export only 30% outside China, you have a different case. And if you export out of that Chinese plant 80 or 90% to the US or to Europe or a non-China location. That's the same with sourcing. So instead of only looking to sectors of industry, and there are a couple of those, and I mentioned them, where the discussion is more logical and more natural, I would say, than in others, you really have to look to the products you make, the trade sensitivity in that, the sourcing and the distribution pattern of your current footprint in Asia, and build on that. You can define what kind of operations or what type of product lines would be the first ones to take a closer look at whether the current footprint is future-proof enough.
Thank you. René and Patrick, we really appreciate you taking the time today to share your insights. This concludes today's webinar, and I also want to thank all of our participants. All content and materials included in this ASCM online event are the property of ASCM and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved.